So here are our speakers for today's workshops. So I'm Jean-Philippe Gagné. I'm the past chair of the section for students in psychology of CPA. I'm also a PhD candidate in clinical psychology at Concordia University. The other members on our panel today, our other speakers, are Alexandra Richard. She's the chair-elect of our section. She is a PhD student, also in clinical psychology at McGill University. We also have Jeremy Richard, who is our graduate student affairs officer within our section. He is a PhD student in counseling psychology at McGill. And finally, we have Alicia Palermo, our communications officer. She's a master's student in forensic psychology at the University of Ontario Institute of Technology. So as you can see, we have a broad panel today. So if you have specific questions for these specific programs, don't hesitate to ask a specific speaker. So here's the outline for our workshop today. So I'm going to start with a few questions for the audience because I'd like to get to know who's in the audience so I can, tailor what I'm saying to you guys today. Then we're going to go over the different programs that you can apply to within psychology, given that it's a very broad domain. Then we're going to go through every single application components that usually come back in graduate school applications. Then I'm going to talk very briefly about the federal scholarships, which are typically called Canada Graduate Scholarships, that you usually apply to at the same time as graduate school. Then we're going to talk about some tips to find a supervisor. We're going to talk about the interview process and how to prepare for those. Then we're going to go over the application timeline, so you don't go over any deadline. Then what to do in case you're rejected. And finally, we'll have a Q&A period, and we'll be able to answer questions in both English and French. So if you have any questions throughout the workshop, please write them down and keep them for the Q&A period. So who are you? So as I said, I have a few questions for the audience just to make sure we know who we are talking to today. So even before starting to talk about the different components of applying to graduate school, I think we all need to ask ourselves the very big question, which is, why do you want to go to graduate school? So again, this is a workshop where we like to have discussions, so I'd really appreciate if some of you could raise your hand just to tell me in a few words why you want to go to graduate school. And I'm pretty sure you have a good idea given that you're here and that it's a very long process that you're about to start. So please don't be shy, just raise your hand and anything that comes to mind. Yes?
I have a lot of questions that I want to answer and I want to have the methods to be able to do that. So I want to do research.
Okay, cool. Very nice. Any other, so basically for the microphone, she said that she has a lot of research questions she wants to answer. She has a lot of methodological ideas in mind, and that research is the right way to go. Why do people want to get a PhD? I'm pretty sure you have a good idea if you're here. It's a long process. Raise your hand, don't be shy.
Or a master's.
Why do you want to go into clinical psychology? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, so PhDs within psychology can be very versatile. You get both the research and the clinical components. Very good answer. Anyone here just because they want to help people? I mean, clearly within psychology we could think that this is one of the reasons. But something we also often hear when we ask that question is just, I need this degree to be able to practice. Kind of like, I want to be a clinical psychologist, and that's what my province has asked me to do. They want me to have a PhD. And of course, it's a fair reason. I mean, probably a lot of people wouldn't go into such long studies if their province didn't require a doctoral degree. However, if that's the only answer you have in mind right now, I would try to encourage you to think beyond this answer of I just need that degree. Try to think about the journey you're about to start, what brought you to that journey, and think about the entire experience that you're going to have. Try to, think about your personal story of what brought you there. Because answering this question is not only helpful while you're applying, because you'll be answering a bunch of different questions during interviews, you'll be writing personal statements, and of course in these statements you need to go way beyond that answer. But also it's going to help you to keep yourself grounded while you're in graduate school. So it's a very long process, it's like a marathon, it's easy to get lost sometimes. So if you just go back to your starting point of like, why am I here? Why is this important for me? It's going to allow you to stay focused during the process. So something to think about. And now we're going to shift to the overview of the different programs you can apply to, again, given that psychology is such a broad area. So, Alicia.
So, as I said, I'm going to go over some of the different programs. So firstly, there's many different subdisciplines of psychology, as I'm sure you all know. And so before applying to graduate school, it's important to think about the particular discipline or subtopics of psychology that you're interested in. So this is just very few that I put down here, but it's important to also remember that within each of these topics, there's also subtopics. So for example, within the topic of forensic psychology, which is what I study in particular, there's such a large range of things that you can study. There's people in my program who study, who do research with police officers. I'm interested in sex offender treatment. So the range within each of these topics is so broad. It's not necessary that you know exactly what you want to study, but it definitely makes it helpful when you're preparing your applications to have something more specific in mind. But of course, if you change your mind, or if your potential supervisor has some other ideas, there's always time and room to make changes as well. So I just am wondering whether anyone has any ideas of what they're particularly interested in within grad school or within these different topics. Has anybody thought about anything for graduate school that they want to pursue kind of more than just kind of having a broad idea of one of these topics? So for the most part, there's 3 general program types within grad school. So the first is a research program or an experimental program. So this is generally just research-based, or you run experiments or studies. So in general, the program involves conducting research, which includes things like doing coursework, writing proposals, collecting data, running studies, defending a thesis or dissertation, but there's no clinical component or practicum involved in this research usually. So forensic psychology, the one that I'm doing in particular, is research-based, so there's no clinical component that I get or counseling component that I get, but there are sometimes opportunities to do practicums, so research practicums. So for example, sometimes forensic programs will offer research that you can do with the Correctional Service of Canada, so where you can go to Ottawa, for example, and do research there instead of just conducting research within your university or within your community. The second type of program are clinical programs. So in general, they place little to no emphasis on research, and most of the emphasis is placed on clinical work and treatments or interventions for various psychopathologies. So students in these sorts of programs are taught to be consumers of research rather than producers of research. So an example of this type of program would be a PsyD program, where there's not much research involved at all. Sometimes there's smaller research projects, but you're not going to have to defend an entire dissertation or anything like that. And then finally, we have our research and clinical programs. So this would be, for example, clinical psychology or counseling psychology. And these sorts of programs try to find a successful balance between research and clinical. So you're kind of doing everything that you would do in a research program and also everything that you would do in a clinical program. So you're trying to find the balance between both of those. So often the amount of work that you're doing is much more than doing one or the other. But a lot of people from what I've heard, find it very, they're very happy with it, and it allows them to kind of see both sides. So to be able to do the research that they love, but also to be able to practice clinically, which they also love. And it kind of leaves room for you to practice clinically or to continue with research or to continue doing both. There's also 3 main types of psychology degrees that you can get. So the first kind of step being a master's degree, whether that's a Master of Arts, Masters of Science, or Masters of Education in psychology. So oftentimes these programs are about 2 to 3 years, and the emphasis is mainly on research, especially if you're in a research program. They often involve coursework, which typically involves some sort of research methods course and also statistics courses, as well as the completion and defense of a thesis or another major research project. Typically, these programs are small, roughly around 10 people. Some are a little bigger, some are a little smaller, and oftentimes that's because you're working directly under a supervisor. And you may be eligible to practice clinically depending on the province. So, for example, if you were to get a master's in clinical psychology, depending on where you are, you might actually be able to practice clinically, but that depends on the province's mandate, basically. Then the second step would be, or if you want to continue, would be a PhD. So these programs are approximately 5 to 7 years, and the emphasis is on research training with clinical training if you're in a clinical program, of course. So again, doing things like coursework, the completion of comprehensive exams sometimes, depending on the program, and the defense of your dissertation. Again, the programs are generally small because you're working directly under a supervisor, and there might also be the opportunity for you to supervise other individuals or other younger students as well. You can also, in these sorts of programs, you have better opportunities to get clinical internships. So I'm going to talk about a PsyD program briefly after this. And so typically, because clinical PhD programs are more widely recognized, there are better opportunities for internships. And there will be an internship fair this afternoon in case anybody is interested, or even if you're not ready or in the boat to actually be applying to internships anytime soon, it might be helpful just to go and see what they're like. What does an internship involve? And of course, you'd be eligible to practice clinically as well after you get if you were to get your PhD in clinical or counseling psychology. And finally, there's this PsyD program. So this program you can apply to directly after your bachelor's degree. You don't have to do a master's first, as you often do for PhD programs, although sometimes there are PhD programs that you can apply to directly from your undergrad. Typically, this is based in a practitioner-scholar model, so these individuals are trained to be consumers of research rather than producers of research, as I talked about earlier. So that means that they're not doing a lot of research, they're mostly learning how to be clinicians. Typically, these programs are larger, so much larger than 10 people, usually around 50 or 60 people, and you're not necessarily working directly under a supervisor. You might have co-supervision, but it's not as hands-on, I would say, as a clinical program or a research program. It might be also more difficult to find internships, again, just because it's less recognized than PhD programs, and you would be eligible to practice clinically still upon completion of the program. Are there any questions so far about the different types of programs or the different degrees? No? Okay. Okay, so how many people would be interested in clinical or counseling psychology? How many people are thinking about that? Okay, so a lot of people. So I know when I was looking at this, I was very confused. So I'm going to try my best to differentiate between the two, but we do have people on our panel that are in counseling psychology and clinical psychology. So if you have any more questions, they would probably be much better at answering it because they're in the program. But in general, clinical psychology involves the care, diagnosis, and treatment of clients. And they focus on more serious mental illnesses, so things like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and oftentimes their focus is in psychodynamic or cognitive behavioral theories, but this will vary depending on the school that you attend, the supervisor that you have, where you do your clinical internship, but those are kind of the two major theories that they focus on. Again, the training emphasizes psychopathology, and these individuals can work in private practice, in hospitals, in prisons. It's very widely, like where they're able to work it's pretty, the variety is pretty large. Counseling psychology, on the other hand, they consult, deliberate, and advise clients, and they focus more on emotional or social issues that arise from different life stressors, so family, school, work. Jeremy was saying earlier that he also does career counseling, so they're looking at kind of a very broad range of social issues that one might face. Their practices are very client-centric, wellness-based, and prevention-based strategies. So that's what they're using more. And they can work in, again, a variety of settings, such as universities, family services, rehabilitation centers. So again, they are very different, but also they're not that different also. So that can be a bit confusing, but once you kind of talk to people, I think is one of the most important things is talk to other graduate students, and you might be able to kind of differentiate which path exactly you want to go down. And within clinical psychology, I'm going to talk about kind of the two main models that clinical psychology programs are often based on. So that's the clinician scientist model and the scientist practitioner model. So both of these models are often based on the specific institution that you're attending. So typically universities will find professors and supervisors who fall into one of these categories, and that's usually what the institution follows. They both focus on multi-level conceptualizations of psychopathology, so they're not just focusing on one basic way that you can view psychopathology, but multiple different ways. And they both focus on evidence-based treatment as well. The clinician scientist model specifically places a very strong emphasis on research, and you're mainly trained to be a researcher, whereas the scientist practitioner emphasizes both clinical and research. So that would be more like a clinical psychology program, for example, and it tends to be kind of less research intensive, but because you're still being trained to be a clinician. So like I said, most PhD programs in Canada are based on this model, but I would say that most programs won't strictly adhere to one particular model. They're not kind of so rigid that they're not looking to kind of expand what they're able to do. But oftentimes they will be based on one or the other. So it's important also to look into that when you are looking into particular programs, specifically within clinical psychology. What kind of training are you specifically looking for?
Yeah, works well. So I'm going to be talking now about the application components. So we're going to go over one after the other. So, of course, something that we can't escape from are grades and transcripts. So, there's a lot of things that people say about the GPA and the grades you need to get into grad school, especially clinical psychology. So, for example, I found this quote from the website of the University of Calgary saying that a GPA of 3.6 out of 4.0 begins to be competitive. However, a GPA of 3.8 out of 4.0 or higher is more typical. So it is true that psychology graduate programs are extremely competitive. Clinical psychology is actually often more competitive than med school. So, and some programs will have a cutoff that they're only going to look at the rest of your application if your GPA is above a certain cutoff. However, there are other universities that will instead ask Supervisor to sponsor students, and then they're really going to look at the entire package. So although we're often looking at an average of A's on your transcript, it's not the only factor for sure that goes into your application. Think about research experiences, think about conference presentations, think about even publications. If you feel that your GPA is more on that lower side, make sure you put great emphasis on the research experience so that your dossier can still stand out. So make sure you order many transcripts early. Sometimes they're mailed directly to the institutions from the institution you're at, but sometimes you're gonna have to scan them, upload them on the portal. Sometimes, they're gonna ask you to mail them yourselves, and make sure you don't open them because they have to be sealed. So please make sure you look at the specific criteria when it comes to things as simple as transcripts, because there are sometimes differences. So make sure you have a lot of them, because often we're applying for a bunch of different schools. And also make sure, for example, if you're from Quebec, look on the website if they're asking also for CEGEP transcripts, because you might need to order them early on. So please make sure you verify every aspect of the website, and prepare a cost of between $7 to $12 for every transcript. However, sometimes if you're still enrolled in an undergraduate program, you can get them for free. So make sure you order a bunch before you graduate. So let's talk a bit about your CV that you're going to be submitting with your application. So some universities will have a specific template, so please follow it if they have a template. However, what we're looking for a CV, whatever program you're applying to, even if it's, PhD in clinical psychology that has, still an emphasis on the clinical work, we're looking for a CV that puts emphasis on academic experiences. Because again, you're applying for programs that are heavily based on research. And these are the types of research skills are the skills that you can get even before you start graduate school. So for example, if you're volunteering, if you're getting an RA position, if you're doing an honors thesis. However, the more clinical skills, you're going to start getting the specific skills you need to practice while you're in graduate school. So committees are not necessarily looking for specific clinical skills, whereas they are for sure looking for research experience. So make sure you put an emphasis on those type of experiences. So in a CV, you want to include, of course, your education background, describe your research experiences, so whether it's volunteering, research assistantships. Some universities offer some summer scholarships to do some research, also NSERC as some of those. If you have conference presentations, include them all. Of course, if they're at the national or international level, it's great, but please do also include the institutional one at your universities or your local conferences. These are excellent on your application. Any awards you got or scholarships. If you have any teaching experience, sometimes people come from a master's program where they got to be a TA. Including that is very important as well. And you can also include relevant practical experience, so some type of clinical work. So we know that often people go to volunteer at a hospital or for a crisis line. Do include these things, but make sure they're not the first thing they see on your CV, and that the academia part is more at the forefront. So while you're writing your CV, make sure you describe your accomplishments. So if you got a specific award or scholarship from your university, it doesn't mean that that other university, that their committee is going to know what it is. So if you're the one person who got it from the entire department or the entire faculty of arts, please make sure you specify this so they understand the prestige of that scholarship. Also, describe your research experience with bullet points. So what role did you play in the laboratory? Were you testing participants? Did you learn about new statistical analyses? Did you run analysis? Did you write an entire paper? Were you participating in lab meetings? Were you coordinating the entire lab because you were an RA? So these are the types of experiences that they're not gonna know unless you write about it. And sometimes at the undergraduate level, we have a bit less experience, so it's important to highlight what we did, and again, to make sure we can stand out. When you're writing, when you're including your publications and your conference presentations in your CV, so for example, posters or symposia presentations or again, publications, I think it's important to use APA style because it shows that you, for example, know about it, but also it looks very professional on your CV. And you can even put your own name in bold so that it catches the eye. So that's usually a recommendation I give. Organize your CV professionally and logically. So for example, you can start with more recent things and then you end with the former experiences you've got, and you can ask your supervisor from a lab you're working in, or some of your professors with whom you have a good relationship to proofread and give their professional opinion. Okay, so graduate record examinations, or GREs, are standardized tests that are often used as an admission requirement for graduate school. So not only in psychology, but also in other disciplines. So the GREs are administered by Educational Testing Service, which is ETS, which is this big company that basically runs the GRE. So there are two different exams that you may have to do. So the first one is the general GRE. It's computerized and has three major components. So the analytical writing, so basically you're writing essays. The quant reasoning, which is basically a math section. And finally, verbal reasoning, which is essentially like an English section, but it also has that logic component of like doing analogies and knowing about different vocabulary words. However, when you're applying for a psychology graduate program, you may also need to do the subject test, which of course is the psychology one. It's a paper-based test that will test you on a variety of domains within psychology, such as learning, so we're talking about like conditioning, reinforcement, language, memory, thinking, sensation, perception, all of these cognitive aspects, neuroscience, mental disorders, developmental psychology, personality, social psychology, and research methods. So take the test early, especially the general one, because then you have the opportunity to take it again. So usually people will do it like the summer before applying. So let's say you're applying this December, you would do it this summer. But some people will decide to do it the summer before, so that if they're not satisfied with the grade they had, they can change it actually. So something to think about. The general one is offered very frequently, so you don't really need to worry about it. However, the psychology one can be very difficult to take. So usually it's offered in September, October, and April. And you have to visit the ETS website to see in your specific city, first, is it even offered? And second, which of these months it's offered. And there are usually limited spots because, again, it's paper-based. So check when the registration date opens, because people will just kind of like all register at the same time. So you make sure you want to make sure you're registering on the date that it opens. So for example, I have a friend from Montreal, so we're lucky to have the test offered. I think it was in October in Montreal. However, she waited a few days and there were no spots left, and she had to go to the States to do that exam. So you just don't want to add more stress to that very long process. So make sure you look on the website of the program you're applying to whether you have to do the GRE. Some programs will say it is mandatory, some will say you don't have to, and then some will say it's recommended. So, you know, if you're already applying to a bunch of programs or are asking for it, might as well. But if it's recommended to all of the programs you're applying to, then, you know, try to weigh the pros and cons. If you think, you know, you have enough time to study and you're going to nail this, it can look good on your application. However, remember that it takes a lot of time to study for these tests. You can also decide to take it and see your score, and then decide whether it's going to help your application or not. Sometimes if you're at an equal level to someone else, maybe having these average or high scores can help you. So if it's recommended, it's worth giving some thoughts of whether you should take it or not. In order to prepare, there are some very good books that you can buy. Usually they're available on Amazon. So for example, there's the one from the official company, ETS. I usually just recommend having that book because it just gives you the perspective of the company that does the test. So their practice tests are very similar, just in terms of like the formatting of the one you're going to do for the real exam. So it's good to have their perspective, but it's also good to have other ones from other companies, like Princeton, for example, has some good books, simply because you're going to have more practice tests and they're going to give you a different perspective that maybe ETS won't necessarily share with you. There are also some courses that you can do for the general one, not the psychology one. They tend to be extremely expensive. Some people will say that they were helpful. Some will say that the books are enough. So think about whether you want to put that money into these crash courses. They're usually like a weekend, a full weekend of like GRE material. So think about whether this is something that you need beyond the books. If you are studying for the psychology one, of course, what you could do is just open all of your undergraduate books, but this sounds extremely overwhelming, and I don't recommend doing that. So you can get, some psychology GRE prep book from Kaplan, which usually cover all of the different aspects of psychology, and they also include 2 practice tests. So I usually recommend going for one of these books instead of like studying your entire bachelor's degree. There are also some flashcards that are available on Amazon, like GRE flashcards that help you learn about the different vocab words that tend to appear in that more like analytical section, the English section. So it's good that you know about these words ahead of time. And of course, do as many practice tests as you can and try to put yourself in the same conditions as the tests. And in these books, they're going to tell you what the conditions are. So in terms of reference letters, you usually need 2 or 3 letters when you're applying to graduate school, whether it's master's or PhD. Make sure that your reference letters, again, are academic and research-oriented if you're applying to a program that has some research. Again, it's really important that you show that you are mastering these research skills. Sometimes the program will specifically ask for an extra letter that is clinically oriented. In that case, go for what they're asking, but the rule of thumb is that they want academic-related letters. So who should you ask for reference letters? So if you're doing, a thesis, whether it's an honors thesis and a more general undergraduate thesis or a master's thesis, make sure you ask your supervisor. If you don't get a letter from your supervisor, it's going to look extremely odd in your application. If you're volunteering or working in a lab, it's very good if you ask the PI of that lab, so your supervisor, given that they've seen you grow within a research setting, so they're going to be able to talk about those specific skills. However, if you're having, if you're not necessarily involved in multiple labs and you need 3 letters, there's also the possibility of asking one of your course instructor. However, if you do so, make sure that it's from a course like a seminar where, there's like perhaps between 10 and 25 people, not like 400 people, so that they got to hear you talk, you participated a lot, so they have something to say about not only your grade, but also the content of your thoughts, about your critical thinking. Also, they got to know you, so they can talk about you on a more personal level. So, if you're asking a course instructor, make sure you have that relationship. And for all of these different professors, make sure you maintain contact with them, because you might be applying in a few years, so you want to make sure that, they have an idea at least once a year of what you're doing. Ask them early, so minimum 1 month in advance, and provide specific instructions. So basically, these different professors are extremely busy. They're probably writing letters for a bunch of different people. So you want to make sure that you are showing them that you're organized, that you're understanding that they're busy. You want them to write a good letter, so give them enough time. And all of the different universities will have their own requirements for the specific template they need, or the specific document they have to use, or whether it has to be mailed, whether it has to be uploaded on an online portal. So make sure that when you're contacting these professors, you are including specific instructions for each university. So for University A, you have to put it in an envelope, seal it, sign on the seal. For that University B, you have to upload it on a portal. For University C, you're going to get a link that you have to fill out. So make sure you provide those instructions. And when you're emailing them to ask them, at least a month in advance, even if they know you pretty well, send your CV, send your transcripts, and maybe some bullet points of what you did for them. So it's going to show you're organized, but it's also going to remind them of what you did. And don't assume that they remember everything, because they could be missing a very important thing you did in their lab. So for your application, you're going to have to write a statement of interest or a personal statement. This is probably the hardest component of your application. So the length varies depending on the universities. So for example, at Concordia, they're asking for a maximum of 1,500 words. Some won't specifically write a word limit, so you have to kind of like decide on your own what makes a good story. The goal of a personal statement is to tell a story for sure, because that's how you're going to catch someone's attention. Think about a text you're reading. If there's a story, even if it's like a research paper, if there's a story involved, your attention will be caught and you will want to learn more about that specific topic or learn more about that specific person. However, you want to tell a professional story. So in other words, don't get too personal. I often hear from professors or DCTs that a very personal story can look a bit odd for them, because you need to show that you understand those professional boundaries. So it's not necessarily a creative contest. You want to stand out because of your own experiences, of your excellent writing skills, and of how that personal story really shows how you got from point A to point B, and point B being that application of going into graduate school. So discuss your research interests in details and why graduate school is essential for you to achieve your career goals. So make sure you highlight what your career goals are. Have your thesis advisor or lab supervisor read it over. These are people who are used to reading different personal statements, so they know whether it's going to stand out or not. So usually in these statements, they're going to ask you to state with whom you want to work, so a potential supervisor. And you don't only say names, you also clearly indicate how your research interests directly match your potential supervisor's interests, and you want to be very concrete. So go in the literature, read their articles, make sure you're familiar with their recent articles, and create that match while you're writing. So ask yourself, how will your previous research experiences be beneficial for that specific lab, and how will they help you navigate that lab and achieve your career goals? So, it's a mutual relationship. It's not only about them helping you become a clinical psychologist or an academic or so forth and so on. It's also about you bringing something to the lab. So, you want to show them how your previous experiences can help that lab grow. And of course, you want to tailor your statement of interest to each institution. Do not just copy paste the entire thing. Why is this supervisor from that specific institution and going to that specific institution the optimal combination for you? Why is it a good fit for you and for them? And finally, what can you get from that specific institution and or supervisor that you can get elsewhere? So highlight how that specific program will help you achieve what you want, and kind of tell, I can't get that anywhere else. So it really highlight the fit. The fit is the number one thing you want. So now I'm going to talk briefly about federal scholarships, given that they usually apply for them at the same time, and that they look, it really looks good if you tell a potential supervisor that you've already applied for these scholarships. You're going to look more competitive, you're going to look organized, and it's going to indicate that maybe they don't even have to provide funding for you. You might be able to bring your own funding. And we're talking about federal scholarships, but there are also some provincial scholarships that I recommend that you go online and look at those, depending on your individual provinces. So at the federal level, there are 3 different agencies that can provide you with a scholarship for graduate school. So in terms of CIHR, this is a health agency. So they're going to be, let me back off for a second. So you are applying to one of these when you're applying for a scholarship, depending on the nature of your research proposal in your application. So if you have, if you're applying to CIHR, it would mean that your research proposal in your application has some very concrete health implications. So for example, if you are examining a specific mental disorder or a new form of therapy, again, then if your population is a population with some mental health issues, then odds are you're going to go for CIHR. But the beauty of psychology is that it's so diverse that it can fall under any of them. So the second one is SHRC, which tends to fund projects that fall under the social sciences and humanities. So if you have a project that belongs more to like social psychology, personality, if your sample is a community sample or a normal sample with not necessarily mental health issues, or if you're looking at just like fundamental social phenomenon, then you might want to go for SHRC. And finally, there is NSERC, which funds projects that fall under the natural sciences and engineering. So in this case, there are some psychology projects that fall under NSERC. If you're looking at like basic mechanisms, so whether it's more on the neuroscience side or more on the cognitive side, so for example, the neuroscience of oxytocin, or the basic developmental pathways of like learning, cognition, language, memory, then it might fall under NSERC. But make sure that the overarching theme of your research proposal are not some clinical implications. It's really you're looking at basic mechanisms and fundamental understanding of humans or animals. So there are scholarships at the master's level and also at the doctoral level. So at the master's level, they're called Canada Graduate Scholarship, master's program. They offer $17.5K for 1 year. And all of the information is on the NSERC website. However, as you can see, the name of the scholarship will change depending on the federal agency you're applying to. And again, there is like all the instructions are on the website. There's a research portal that you submit all of your different documents to. And when you're on the research portal, you have to click whether it's CIHR, NSERC, or SHRC. At the doctoral level, it's a bit different. So it doesn't all fall under one website. You have to go to the specific website of the federal agency, and they all have their specific instructions. So it's all different. Even like the amounts are different depending on the agency. So for example, CIHR only has one type of scholarship at $35K per year for 3 years. However, for NSERC and SHRC, they have 2 different layers depending on where you rank. And another possibility is to apply for a Vanier Canada Graduate Scholarship. You can apply for a Vanier scholarship under any agency. It has this specific scholarship is valued at $50,000 per year for 3 years, and it puts equal emphasis on academic record, research, and leadership. Typically, when you're applying for scholarships, whether it's at the master's level or PhD level, although the application is longer, at the doctoral level, you have to fill out the application form, you have to submit a CV, and often, not always, but often you have to submit a Canadian Common CV. So this requires you to go on the Canadian Common CV website, select the template for the specific scholarship you're applying to, and filling the different categories on the website. And then once you're all done, it's going to generate a PDF for you that follows the specific template. Of course, you have to submit transcripts. Sometimes you have to, it's paper. I'm thinking about SHRC doctoral. Sometimes you have to scan them and upload them online. So make sure you read the instructions properly. Reference letters. Again, usually need between 2 or 3. This time around, make sure that they are research-oriented 100%. These scholarships will fund a student who has completed a program with a very heavy research component. So make sure these letters are talking about your research skills 100%. You will have to write a research proposal, which is one of the main components of your application. So a research proposal has to show that you understand the different components of a thoroughly designed experiment or study. Usually at the master's level, you would propose 1 or 2. At the PhD level, you might want to propose 3 different studies, depending on your lab for sure. But you have to show that it's feasible for the specific program you are in. And make sure you write a research proposal using lay terms, lay language, because sometimes your reviewers are from a different discipline within psychology, and so you want to make sure that they understand. So usually a research proposal would have background information, hypotheses, a bit on your methodology, expected results, and some implications. So it's like a very short proposal. Sometimes they require additional materials, so a bunch of different statements that you're going to have to write. So for example, one that describes your program of study. Why is this specific program a good fit for you? Why is it going to help you achieve your career goals? A leadership statement, especially for the Vanier Scholarship. A statement on your activities and contributions. So what did you do in and out of the university? If there were any interruptions during your training and you have a strong rationale for that, sometimes they're going to ask you to write about these specific delays. And I think CIHR asks for a space and facilities statement. So does your university, your lab, give you the space and the equipment you need to complete your project? Because sometimes they require specific technologies, so you want to show that your universities is giving you these specific tools.
All right, so I'm going to be talking about how to find a supervisor for your graduate studies. This is one of the most maybe difficult parts of your application, and it's also one of the most personal components of the application. So I'm going to try and focus on the parts that are more common and general across. But I think if you spoke to all of the presenters here today, we'd all have quite different paths to how we came to match with our supervisor. So before I start talking about how to find a supervisor, I wanted to just spend a minute or two talking about what the role of a supervisor is, because I think it's important to have an idea of that to kind of know what am I looking for in a supervisor. So first and foremost, your supervisor's main role is to just oversee your academic career and to help you reach your academic potential. So for most psychology graduate programs, this is obviously going to be highly emphasizing your research. So generally, your supervisor is heavily involved in your research, and they're going to be involved in helping you plan studies, provide support, provide resources for that, and this is really from the planning stage and choosing a topic, all the way to kind of publishing and defending your thesis. In addition to that, your supervisor is going to be just generally involved in just setting work expectations, providing feedback on a yearly basis, evaluating you usually on a yearly basis, and just providing general support as you go along your program to make sure that you're reaching the milestones of your program in a timely manner. So now moving on, there are programs that work in different ways about when you would find your supervisor. So for the majority of psychology programs, it's the student's responsibility to find a supervisor prior to admission into the program. So this would mean that your admission into a graduate program would be contingent on you finding a supervisor. However, there are some programs that you will get into the program and then you have to find a supervisor after you're admitted. So there's usually a few supervisors you can choose from. But once again, this is not very common. For the most part, you do have to find a supervisor on your own prior to admission. Usually, if you want to know what program you're applying to, what the process for this is, you can consult the departmental website, and this information is readily available online. All right, so now assuming that you do need to find a supervisor, where do you begin? So you'll definitely want to start by doing some of your own research and just compiling a list of potential supervisors that you'll be interested in working with. So the first thing that you'll want to focus on is obviously the supervisor's research interests and how that matches with your own. So you'll be working with this supervisor within their area of research for anywhere from 2 to 7 years. And you'll be spending countless hours and more than hours, years, reading about, writing about, designing studies, going back, troubleshooting on this topic within your supervisor's domain. So it really is crucial to your graduate experience that you have at least some, and hopefully much more than some, interest in the topic that your supervisor is working on. You'll also want to consider if the supervisor is currently accepting students. So I think this is something that when you're applying, you're not generally aware of beforehand, but for many reasons, supervisors don't accept students in a given year based on funding, based on constraints within the program, admission. So you'll want to look online usually. Departments often post this information. They'll post a list of these are the supervisors who are taking students this year. If it's not posted online, you can also reach out to the graduate program or to the supervisor themselves, which I'll be talking about in a little bit. You'll then also want to kind of consider the supervisor's supervision style. So what would it be like working with this supervisor, and how would that match with your own kind of personality and working style? So some questions you'll want to consider are, have they supervised many students before? What do they expect of their students in terms of research productivity, teaching, time spent in the lab? Will they be available to meet with you when you need them and provide you ongoing support? How often do they publish? Do their students tend to publish and be first authors on projects, etc.? So you might be thinking, how do I find this information online? And the truth is that not all of this information is available online, but a lot of it is. You just need to know where to look. So often programs have a kind of faculty profile page for each supervisor, and you can look at that and get a lot of information on how often they're publishing, how many students they have in their lab. Are you seeing their students on their publications, or are you seeing the supervisor's name last where the students are taking the role? This is all things that you'll want to be looking at. It's also quite common that supervisors have a laboratory website where you can also get a lot of this information. And then Jeremy's going to be talking about the interview process where you can connect with the supervisor directly and also the supervisor's graduate students to get a sense of what it would be like to work with this person, what's their personality like, and what's their working style. All right, so after you make your list of potential supervisors, you'll generally want to reach out and kind of introduce yourself and let that supervisor know that you're interested in working with them. So we put together a few pointers here on what to include in that email. It's usually an email, or if you meet them face-to-face. So first you'll want to start by introducing yourself and stating why you're writing. So my name is Alexandra. I completed my undergraduate degree in psychology, and I'm looking to pursue a PhD in clinical psychology, for example. When you are expressing your interests, you'll want to try to get as specific as possible. So you don't just want to say, I want a PhD in clinical psychology, so I want to work with you. You'll want to say why you want to work with that supervisor doing that research at that university, why your experiences and your training, essentially, so far will make you a good fit to work with them. It's generally a good idea to attach your CV and unofficial transcript so they can take a look and see your experiences, and also highlight in the email any relevant research or experience related to the kind of work that they're doing. And you'll also want to offer opportunity for further discussion, perhaps to have a video conference call or even to meet in person. So this sounds like a lot, but you also want to try to keep the email as short and concise as possible. You don't want to be writing them your whole life story in an email. This is really a first impression. You want to include what's going to stand out to make you pop out in their mind so that they offer you to come in for an interview. Also, beware of spelling mistakes, grammar mistakes, and make sure the email is professional. You don't want to be writing, hey, it'll be dear Professor so-and-so, and keep it very, very professional to make a good first impression. So this is just an overview, and like I said, the process is very personal. There's a lot of different pathways you can get to finding your supervisor, and this is essentially just an overview of how to start that process. You can also find online, many universities have guidelines, tips, templates that are actually quite thorough, and I found them by writing in Google how to find a supervisor for graduate school, and I got a whole bunch of manuals from universities that were actually super helpful and outlined the process nicely. And also, you have to speak to other graduate students. This is a huge resource when you're applying to grad school, especially when you're looking to find a supervisor. And I'd like to insert a shameless plug for our CPA's mentorship program, where undergraduate students can be matched with a graduate student mentor to kind of help them through this process and provide that one-on-one support and guidance while you're going through this process. So I now wanted to if you're a graduate student and you're already in a supervisory relationship, what are the qualities that are important in your supervisory relationship that you think others might want to hear about? I hope this helped, and we're now going to be moving on to the interview process.
Thank you. Okay, great. So hi, everyone. I hope you're still paying attention at this point of the presentation. So I'll just briefly go over interviews and what that looks like for graduate school. So some programs will have a mandatory interview, some will not. Some will be optional, some might be with your supervisor. It really depends on the situation. So really, how would one prepare for an interview? Well, it's important to review all the materials that you've submitted in your application, because you might get questions about that and you don't want to be caught off guard. For example, if you have, research lab experience in 2014, you better remember what that was, because you might get a question on it. So always be aware of what you included in your CV and be willing to elaborate on those things, especially if you're not like Jean-Philippe mentioned, to have little bullet points for each of your lab experiences. If you don't include that, then be willing to elaborate on that during the interview. Okay. Also, you might want to identify holes and gaps in your application and bring that forward, because your supervisor potential supervisor might have identified those. And also, it's important to be honest and open regarding what you're looking for in supervision during this interview. So you might be asked questions, for example, like, so what do you expect out of a supervisor? And having an answer ready for that question is really important. And you know that famous question, so what are your greatest weaknesses? And then you're like, and you're always caught off guard. Hopefully you're not asked that question, but if you are, at least have an answer on hand. So for preparing for interviews, this really depends on your style. So some people like to go in front of a mirror and prepare like mock interview by looking at themselves. Other people might be willing to practice with others that are in their program, maybe your colleagues or even your friends that have no idea what psychology is. You could also prepare like a semi-structured script if that makes you feel better, feel more prepared. Whatever really helps you feel more confident in that interview. So yeah, once again, potential as a supervisor, what are your research and clinical interests and why that's the case? Also be prepared to talk about your past research and also your future research. And two of the main questions that might come up would be, why our research lab? So why this lab at this school? And why do you think you would be a good fit for this lab? So those are important questions that might come up. So as for the interview format, so there are many different formats. You could be, interviewed over Skype. Is everyone okay? Okay, you could be interviewed over Skype, over the phone. It could also be in person, and this in person can really differ. I've heard cases where individuals have had a interview one-on-one, but I've also heard of group interviews where a supervisor brought in other potential students to have an interview. It could also be with the supervisor and other students in the lab, either together or independently. So at first you would meet with the supervisor, and then you would meet with other students from the lab to sort of have a more thorough overview of who you are as a person. So be prepared for that. And there's also cases where you'll be invited to a lab dinner, for example, and you'll sit down and eat lunch with the lab, and they want to see how you'll interact with them, how you'll be with them in a more casual setting. And this is also a place for you to sort of show how you would belong in that lab. So overall, there's lots of different potential experiences. So I've heard of people that have been interviewed over the phone. For myself, I had emailed back and forth with my supervisor, and then my supervisor invited me for an interview, and we did that interview in person. So in that interview, I was asked about, what are my expectations in this lab when it comes to research? What are my expectations for a supervisor? Is it going to be more independent, or is it going to be more of collaborative work? How do I work as a team? How do I work independently? So it really varies on a case-by-case basis. And other relevant information would be dress code. So how would you dress to an interview? Anyone have any ideas? I mean, I see people in the room that are all dressed quite well. I would advocate for this type of attire. I mean, for men, you don't want to dress too fancy too, depending also on the lab. Like, I wouldn't come in dressed in a full tuxedo because that's a bit, over the top, but, nice dress shirt, pants, etc. For women, I won't say that I'm an expert in any way of dressing to impress at an interview, but typically you want something more polished than just jeans and a t-shirt. You want to wear something like a nice blouse, types of context for labs. Like, if you're working for with children, it might not be ideal to come in dressed as a suit because that's not how you would be working with kids. But if you're applying for someone that does work in, let's say, clinical or organizational settings, and it's more of a fancier setting, then you might want to dress for that position. Now, application timeline. So how to begin preparing your application, how long do you have, what to do at each step. So right now, let's say you were applying for this academic year. Right now we'd be in the May to August period. So this is the time where you really want to be thinking about the program, thinking about the research you want to do, maybe thinking about applying for funding, and if you want to gather any additional experience over the summer, that might bolster your application. Then come to September, you want to prepare possibly for the GREs and also other funding applications. In October, this is really when you would want to consider different programs, determine which programs you want to apply to. If you have the means, you could possibly visit the schools or contact supervisors. And also, this is typically when the funding applications would be due, so that's when you would have to submit those applications. October is really the ideal time also if you want to contact your supervisor. So that list of supervisors that you compiled, contacting those supervisors in October or like end of October or beginning of October is typically the ideal time. Then come November, since you want to be in advance, you want to ask for your letters of reference. So from your 2 to 3 letters of reference, you want to ask around that time. You could also ask for your transcripts. But you want to be sure that your transcripts are as up-to-date as possible. So if you're currently, if you finished a fall semester, you want to have those grades updated as well. So try to get the most up-to-date version of your transcript because that might really help with your application. Come December or January, so you want to have been working on your personal statement and CV before then, but this is really when you want to finalize those things and then submit your applications. Come February, it's possible that that's when you would officially visit the campuses to where you've applied. This is when you could have your interview or meeting with your supervisor. And then March is when acceptance offers or decline offers tend to roll in around this point, March, April. And then either you celebrate or you regroup for next year. So any questions on this timeline? I know I just sort of flew through that, but I'd be willing to take any questions if something was unclear. Yeah. For Canada, however, internationally, I'm not sure. I don't know if someone on my panel would know about more international applications. Okay, so for the States, it appears to be the same. And I know for typically French schools, since in Quebec, their applications tend to be later than the English schools. So where the English schools would be like December 1st or 15th, I've often seen French schools like Université de Montréal, their applications being due in like January or early February. So you might want to check the schools and they'll have those dates outlined. You've seen March for McGill? Okay. Okay, so yeah. So typically around like December to March would be the range of application. I guess it's hard to tell. It's really case by case, but yeah, you're absolutely correct. So it might happen that you will be rejected upon your first application. So don't be discouraged. Know that there's more denials than acceptance and that it's highly competitive to get into graduate school. And also know that situational factors can play an important role. So maybe your supervisor wanted to sponsor your application, but other issues came up within the department that they weren't able to take on additional students, or they didn't have the funding to take on additional students. So be aware that those other factors might also play a role. So most people actually apply multiple times to graduate school. So that might be something to consider for the next following years. So when it comes to maybe preparing your application, maybe identifying gaps in that application and how to bolster your application for the next academic year might be something that's important to do. It's also important to take a moment, spend a little self-care because it's really difficult to be working on these applications for so long, especially if you're applying for funding applications and graduate applications and working on GREs, etc. So taking the time to take care of yourself after all of that is really important. And also once you've, let's say you've received a rejection letter, take the time to sort of process that, but after the fact, try to acknowledge what were your weaknesses in your application, what were your strengths, where do you need to build, and really restructure your application based on your strengths and try to build on those. It's important that you don't, let's say you apply the following academic year, it's important that you don't submit the same documents all over again. So gather more experience, maybe research, lab work, conference presentations, publications, or even volunteer work, and add that to your application and then reapply. They'll want to, so in that case, if you take a certain time of the year off, like for example, myself, I didn't apply to graduate school to say what you did over that gap and how that might strengthen your application. All right, so that's it for my portion of the presentation, and I would be more than willing to answer any of the questions that you have for any of the speakers, may it be with regards to the programs we're in, to supervisors, to applications, whatever it may be.
So yeah, it's a very, if you have questions, it's really the time to ask them, and we're going to ask you to go to the mic to make sure that the video recorder can catch those questions. So please, as Jeremy said, ask a question about any component of the presentation, or if you're interested in specific aspects of, for example, forensic or counseling or clinical. These are programs that we're currently in, so don't be shy, and it's time to ask your questions. So, and we do have a few minutes, so let's take advantage of that. Yeah, please go to the mic.
So I'm wondering about how it is that funding works when you do, if you do get one of the tri-agency scholarships, then how is that paid out to you? Does it go through the lab? Does it go through your supervisor? And then also, if you were to get into grad school but not win one of those scholarships, then what would you do about funding?
Yeah, sure. So when you're applying for a Canada Graduate Scholarship at the master's level, you're including different schools in your application that you're applying to. So I think it's up to 5. So these universities are also going to evaluate your application and like submit potential candidates to the agencies, and then the agency is going to decide who gets the scholarship. Then the portal usually gets updated April 1st at the master's level, and then you see whether you got it or you were rejected, or if you're on a wait list, but for each school. So for example, you could get it at a specific school, but be on the wait list for another university. So let's say you do get it, and then you start the program. The agency like gives the money to the university, and then the university gives you the money. Basically, that's how it works. If you do not get a scholarship, then if you're in a funded program, they're going to find other ways to give you a similar amount. So it can be through other awards that the university or department offers. It can be from grant money from your lab. It can be from a TA-ship, a research assistantship, or a combination of all of these different things. You know, if you're very lucky, you're just going to have the university and supervisor give you the same amount, but then they're probably going to ask you to reapply for the following year. Thanks.
Okay, great presentation, everyone. So my question is about what does it mean if a program is accredited? Why is it important to apply to a CPA accredited program, especially for doctoral programs? And what are the implications for students there?
So in Canada, we have some programs that are CPA accredited. There are no longer any APA accredited programs in Canada. And in the States, there are no longer CPA accredited programs, but there are some APA accredited programs. So in Canada, a program that did get the accreditation from CPA basically has like that stamp approval from CPA saying that it meets a bunch of different competencies and criteria. So basically it has that recognition from CPA saying that this program has a very thorough training according to their specific criteria. So every few years, from 3 to 7 years, these programs are required to do a self-study to show that students in their program learn about these specific competencies and criteria, and so forth and so on. And they also get a side visit from CPA. They're going to meet with the director of clinical training. They're going to meet with the students. They're going to meet with a bunch of other faculty to ensure, again, that these criteria are met. So the accreditation is specifically for clinical programs, just to make sure everyone gets that piece. And yeah, so the clinical components, so clinical and counseling, anything that requires licensure to do some clinical practice afterwards. So, and then when it's time to apply for internship at the end of your program, you will be way more competitive if you're coming from an accredited program, and some internship sites will require, most actually internship sites will require that you come from an accredited program. So it's also very helpful for licensure after. If you want to find a job in academia, they will require that you come from an accredited program, so either CPA or APA. So make sure that to think about your career goals, think about your internship goals, maybe from the start when it's time to pick a university, and look at whether they are accredited or not. The list is actually available on the CPA website of which universities are accredited. Very good question, because you don't think about that when you're an undergraduate student. Yes, please go to the mic.
Psychology degree. So if you have actually opportunities to work in other countries, how actually this works. If I want to go back to Europe, if I want to work in Latin America. Yeah.
So basically, I think you're asking about opportunities in other countries while you're doing a clinical program, or if you want to go back afterwards.
Or if it's actually recognized the title, because I know how
Okay.
Spanish, when you come from Spain to here, it's so hard.
Okay, or
But I think
okay.
the other way around maybe easier.
So also, if is your training going to be recognized if you want to go somewhere else afterwards? So I mean, I could answer to different aspects of that point. So, for example, during your training, no, that wasn't your specific question, but I can talk a bit about that as well. Sometimes you have like a summer practicum in a clinical program, so you don't have any courses at the same time, so that might be a good time to seek opportunities in other provinces or in other countries to get that diversity, get a training with hospitals that have different mentalities. So that's a way to get experiences internationally. Like if you have a practicum, a clinical practicum that's not at the same time as other obligations. If you're thinking about internship, sometimes people are going to do an internship in the States. So for internship, it's usually Canada or States. So of course you need to think about the implications of going to the States, like for example, visa and other things to think about. However, once you're licensed in a specific province, doesn't mean you're licensed in other provinces and other countries. Not necessarily, and it will vary depending on the province and on the country. So usually, let's say you're licensed in a specific province, but then you want to move to another one. Odds are you're going to have to take the jurisprudence and ethics course / exam to show that you understand the ethics of that specific province or territory. There might be a specific exam, like the EPPP. Maybe you took it in a specific, you didn't take it because your province wasn't requiring it, but then another province asked for it, so then you need to prepare for a licensure exam. If you go to the States, maybe you're going to have to take, again, to take some ethics courses for a specific state or demonstrate competency in several other ways, but it's going to vary based on the province or the state. It's going to depend where you're coming from, and if you're going to Europe, they probably have their own specific requirements. So for example, in Quebec, if you're coming from somewhere else but you want licensure in Quebec, there's a French exam. So for example, in other countries, they might have their own language exam or their own competencies or exams that you have to prepare for. So it varies a lot. Yeah. I think we're out of time, but if there's like one last question, we're more than happy to take it. Or if you have questions, but we're a bit too shy to go to the mic, we're of course going to be hanging out in this room for like a few minutes, so please come to talk to us. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending this workshop today. Best of luck with your application. This is a very complicated process, but you have all the tools you need now, and don't hesitate to contact us. Go see the workshop online. It was videotaped, and we're also going to put the slides online. So best of luck to everyone. Thank you.